that story, but then that name stuck with them. And so since time immemorial, we've called that particularly tribe of Blackfoot-speaking peoples Piikani. And in just recent times, when they had the border put in there, when the white people, or the white-speaking peoples, divided the continent into British North America and the United States of America, well, it was probably during that time that we split up the Piikani tribe. So those people that were north in what they called Canada remained Piikani, or Apatus Piikani, and then those ones that were south of the new borderline we called Amskapi Piikani. And Amskapi basically means across the border. So those were our cousins living across the border. But altogether, they're one people, they're one tribe, the Piikani. And so the Piikani are 1/4 of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. And that's their symbol traditionally. They're on the left, and on the right is their present-day flag for their First Nation, for the Piikani people. So this is one tribe that exists here in Canada, and this tribe actually has a reserve, for lack of better words, what's left over of our homeland. But their reserve is located near Pincher Creek, the little town of Brockett, up near Head Smash and Buffalo Jump, in that particular part of the Blackfoot country, which has a lot of history, by the way. So this is where these people chose to live. So if we move to the next image, let's actually take a look at the next tribe. Now this is the Siksika. Now the Siksika, when you translate that word into English, it literally translates into Blackfoot. So Siksika means Blackfoot. And the Siksika are another 1/4 of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Now the Siksika tribe, apparently they got the name from walking over forest fires, so the story is told. And that at one point, the other Blackfoot-speaking people saw members of that tribe that their moccasins were black from walking over blackened, burnt earth, burnt grass. And so they got that nickname that stuck right up until present days. And that's the Siksikaitituans, the Siksika. And that's actually one tribe, one of 4 tribes that make up the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So already we covered the Piikani is the one tribe, Siksika is the other. Now there's 2 more tribes you need to talk to. We kind of touched on the one. So let's look at the next image. So this image is of the Gaina, or Againa, the many chiefs. And so this is kind of what they're known as. Now Againa, they're kind of one of the larger bands that are in the middle between the Siksika and the Piikani in those days. And now this symbol here, that's the Againa symbol, Againa, and then the other symbol obviously is their present-day flag. Now this tribe makes up 1/4 of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. And in fact, the Gaina, they're known as many chiefs, but they're more widely known, particularly amongst other tribes, as the Bloods, the Blood tribe. And there's some talk as to how they actually got that name. Some people say that they got that name from our enemies because they looked like they had bloodied faces when they went into war and were victorious. But I've heard other stories say that actually the word that they confused with blood was the white ermine skin, white pelt, or weasel pelt people, because they would wear those sort of pelts with their clothing, and they were well known for that. So I would like to get more information on that, truly. But this tribe was known as the Bloods, and to the rest of the Blackfoot tribes, we know them as Againa, the Gaina. And so let's actually move on to the next image. Now this image is Piikani. Like I mentioned, the Piikani were so big, and because of the border that was put there, these people live on the south side of the border. Now, to the Americans, they're known as Blackfeet. That's wrong. Their name has nothing to do with Blackfeet or a Blackfoot, not like the Siksika, which means Blackfoot. Skapi Piikani are basically the same people as the northern Piikani. They just live across the line in the United States of America. Now you see in that image there their traditional sign, but also their present-day flag. And so these people live in Browning, Montana, in the United States of America. And they also make up 1/4 of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Now altogether, if we look at the next image, before I forget, these are the modern tribes of Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Traditionally, we've always had 4. A lot of people think that we've only had 3 tribes of Blackfoot. That is completely false. If you know our history as Blackfoot-speaking peoples, we've always had 4 tribes protecting the 4 corners of our lands, of what we call Kitawahsinoon. Now, one of these bands that used to exist were the Siksikaitsitapi, or the small robes. But because of disease and warfare, and because of one particularly nasty battle back in 1865, which almost wiped them out when they were attacked by the Crows and the Groven and those tribes, these people had to go back to the other Blackfoot tribes, but they were greatly reduced in numbers because of warfare and because of disease. Now, disease was the big killer for the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. The Blackfoot weren't destroyed by any other nation. Not the Americans, not the Canadians, and not even any other First Nation. We were too big and too strong and too powerful. What wiped out the Blackfoot people or reduced us was the number of diseases that we experienced from the time that smallpox was first brought to these shores. So who knows from the 1500s up until the 17th century how many diseases affected our people. But we do know from our winter counts, from our oral history, that one of the first diseases that we were aware of was smallpox. That was 1763. And that was the beginning of just one of 11 diseases that seriously reduced the population of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. And this is what happened to us. So the Siksikaitsitapi, the small robes, they were actually one of those bands, first Blackfoot bands that were seriously affected by all of these elements. And so when they were reduced, they end up joining with the Piikani. Hence the reason why the Piikani are such a huge tribe that they had to break into the northern Piikani and the southern Piikani, because of all these extra people. And so when the Siksikaitsitapi disappeared as that 4th group of Blackfoot-speaking peoples, then the Piikani took their place, because there was one big tribe that broke into 2. So that's kind of a little bit of an explanation regarding the Blackfoot-speaking peoples today and who the Siksikaitsitapi were. And we know that the Siksikaitsitapi people were actually their own people, because when they went to trade with trading companies, they never identified themselves as either Siksika, Gaina, or Piikani, but as Siksikaitsitapi, the small robes. So we know that they were a 4th band that used to exist up until about 1865, and then after that time, then their time, as I said, was kind of gone, and they had to join with the Piikani, the other Piikani tribes, for protection. So let's move on to the next slide here. And now here we can see the 4 present-day tribes of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, the Siksikaitsitapi. So we can see on the one side there's a Gaina, the blood tribe as they're known. There's a Siksika, or the Blackfoot, as they're known in English. And then there's the Piikani, Apatusi Piikani, or the Northern Piikani, Skinny Piikani, whatever you want to call them, but they're the ones that live up here in Canada. And then their cousins, the Amskapi Piikani, is that blue flag at the end there. And these are the Blackfoot-speaking peoples who live in the United States of America. But all together, we make up the Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So let's look at the next image. Now over here we have a picture of, in our language we would say like Kitawahsinoon, our land. And that's what it basically means. This is our land, our homeland, the homeland of the Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Now if you look at that particular image, you can see that map. And so the lands that the Blackfoot-speaking peoples lived on up until pre-contact were the lands that you see there. Now, there is Blackfoot all along the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, right from the Peace River all the way down to Oklahoma. So the Blackfoot people, we knew this continent very, very well, even before we ever met the first settlers or Europeans. Now, what the Blackfoot considered our homeland were those lands that existed from the Rocky Mountains. In our language, we call it Mistakists. So we know the Rocky Mountains as the backbone of the earth. Now, from the backbone of the earth all the way east, out to the Qu'Appelle Valley, Touchwood Hills, Nut Mountain, up near Prince Albert, just before you go into Manitoba. That's how far the Blackfoot homeland went, right up into those areas like you can see on the map. And then from the North Saskatchewan River, where present-day Rocky Mountain House, Edmonton, Prince Albert, from the North Saskatchewan River all the way to the Yellowstone River. These are the lands that the Blackfoot people considered our homeland. And you can kind of see that in there. Kitawahsinoon. I'm not too sure if I'm saying that right. But in the Blackfoot language, that would basically translate to, we are the people of the land of the buffalo. Because to the Blackfoot people, it was Imi, the bison or the buffalo, that defined our land. So our ancient stories told us of these things. In fact, it was our ancient stories that told us that these lands were given to us as a gift by the creator of the heavens and earth, by Itsabetapiopa, our opposite Doki, the creator or the source of life. And that it was he who actually provided these lands for us. And that's a deep part of the Blackfoot belief. In fact, I just kind of want to mention the Blackfoot have no migration stories. So according to our oral history, we've always been here. After the flood, whether that was a biblical flood or if that was the Ice Age flood, our Blackfoot people have no migration stories. We've always been here. And so over that course of thousands of years, literally, we've known all our neighbors, and we've known of tribes that have traveled through our lands, going from one place to the other. So the Blackfoot-speaking peoples have been in this part of the world for a long, long time. The archaeological record says at least the last 5,000 years. It's possible that our people have been here. But we know from the bow and arrow and from the Atlatl and places like Old Woman's Buffalo Jump that our people for sure have been here at least for the last 2,500 years. Now actually, let's move on to the next image. Now here we have kind of a sharper image of the Blackfoot homeland. And like I said, you can kind of see, I want to show you this one in particular because to the Blackfoot people, we have stories, like I mentioned, ancient stories that go back into the past, time immemorial. And a lot of these stories are our origin stories as Blackfoot people. And all of those stories happened here in our homeland. In fact, within all of that area that we consider our homeland, we have ancient stories to cover those corridors. And we'll talk a little bit about that today as we move on. Now, as we go to the next image, excuse me. Now, these same stories as I was talking about, they tell us that Imi, the buffalo, was actually created as a gift for our people. This is what the Blackfoot people believe. So our stories reflect these stories and many sacred sites that exist throughout our territory. So to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, it's no mistake that we had such zealousness over our lands to the point that if people came onto our lands without the proper protocols or without approaching us properly, then usually there was serious trouble ahead. Lots of there was bad things that happened, violence, etc. But let's move on to the next part of our story here. So for those of people who don't know who the Blackfoot-speaking people are, the Siksikaitsitapi, I just want to let you know that we're an ancient people, and the thing is always, for the Blackfoot people, this animal, Ini, this was our staff of life, because he provided everything for us. He provided our food, our clothing, our shelter. He provided our bedding, winter clothing. In fact, there was hundreds of other uses that the Blackfoot had for this animal. So long as this animal existed in its millions, we had no want. We didn't even need the trade goods that came to us later on. This animal provided everything that we needed to exist out here in the prairies where we live. So let's move on to the next symbol. So these great northern herds, wherever they went, we followed them. And that was what the Blackfoot people did. And in fact, like I mentioned earlier, our homeland, it was defined by Ini, by the buffalo, because wherever he traveled, we followed. From the dog days up until the time before this animal was almost extirpated or became extinct, our people followed him everywhere on the northern plains. In fact, all of that land that I mentioned between the Rocky Mountains to the Qu'Appelle Valley, from the from the North Saskatchewan River all the way to the Yellowstone River, well, all of these places, this was all buffalo land. In fact, north of the Yellowstone, this is the cycle, the area that the northern herds would travel, and our people would follow them. And in fact, when you go north of Edmonton, you come across wood buffalo, but you no longer see any plains buffalo, even in those days, because that was sort of the boundary, the northern boundary for the herds. They wouldn't go any farther than the North Saskatchewan, nor would the northern herds go too far south past the Yellowstone. They kind of just stayed up in this in the Blackfoot territory, what we considered our Blackfoot territory, our land. And this is the animal that we hunted up in the plains. So wherever he went, we basically followed. I just like to point that out. And if you look at this particular map, that's another map of the Blackfoot lands, and you can see how vast these lands truly are. There's like from the Rocky Mountains all the way almost out to Manitoba. So in the dog days, our people were basically on foot, and the dog was our beast of burden. But even in the dog days, the Blackfoot people were following Ini all over the northern plains. And in fact, this boundary that you see here is pre-horse, pre-contact. And at that time, there literally would have been estimates of up to 250,000 Blackfoot living within this land. They would be as numerous as the Navajo or any of these other First Nation tribes. Now our people, like I said, it was disease that wiped out the majority of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples that used to exist on this continent. But at one time, all of those people used to control the area that you see. So if we move on to the next image. Okay, so this is the dog days. Maybe we can bring that image up a little bit more. But like I mentioned, in the dog days, the Blackfoot were more concerned mostly with hunting the buffalo. And so long as we could see it, then we were content, we were satisfied. As long as we could see the herds, we were fine. When we couldn't see the herds, then we became a little concerned, because being on foot, you had to travel a far distance just to be able to find this animal. So this was in the dog days. And when we speak of the dog days, it kind of means this is the time before the horse when we used dogs as our beast of burden. And it was our dogs that helped us move our camps. So our people were existing on Kitawahsinoon since this time, the dog days. And that's literally was since our beginning of our existence for untold thousands of years up until today. So if we move on to the next image, here's another map of Kitawahsinoon. And here you can kind of see where we're talking about the boundaries of our lands. Now, Siksikaitsitapi, I'm thinking that's how you say it probably. I kind of broke it down a bit, but that's the North Saskatchewan River. And like I said, all the way down to the Yellowstone River, from the Rocky Mountains all the way out to the Qu'Appelle Valley and Touchwood Hills, this is what we considered our homeland. So let's move to the next image. You know, that being said, I also want to point out, if you look at any of the historical records like George Bent, they confused the Blackfoot with a lot of the Arapaho, Groven natives. And there is historical records, even our oral history of the Blackfoot people being as far south as the Cimarron River, and there's like 700 lodges of these Blackfoot that were camped along with Arapaho and Cheyenne, even as early as 1825. So our homelands didn't restrict our movement. There was many, many Blackfoot on the western slopes of the Rocky Mountains, all the way down into Texas and Oklahoma, all the way up to the Peace River, and all the way out to the Manitoba Escarpment. So our people traveled everywhere. We knew this continent very, very well. I just like to point that out. Now, at this image we're kind of looking at here, if you can kind of move it in a bit, this is how our people used to live. Now, at one time, the Blackfoot people would have been just one tribe. But over time, they would have got larger and larger, and then they would have broken into different tribes. And this is what happened with the Blackfoot people. Over the centuries, the different bands amongst our people, they developed the habit of living in different parts of our territory. So the Blackfoot, you can't say that the Blackfoot are mountain people or our plains people or our foothills people, because we were all of these things. The land that we lived in was so vast and so huge that my people, the Siksika, other Blackfoot people called us Siksikaitsitapi, which basically means plains people, because my people were living way out in the eastern parts of our country, in the northern parts of our land, whereas the Piikani were farther to the west and farther to the south, and the Gaina would have been somewhere in the middle. Now that being said, our people learned to live, as I mentioned, in different parts of our territory, and they would defend our territory in those parts of our land. But amongst our tribal people, all Blackfoot-speaking peoples, the Siksikaitsitapi, we could travel freely throughout our own country with no fear, because we were visiting family, cousins, relations, friends from other tribes, our own Blackfoot-speaking people. So for us and for our allies to travel within Kitawahsinoon was not dangerous. But for other tribes to come onto the Blackfoot lands without permission or protocols, it was very dangerous for them. So let's move on to the next image. Now here we see some of the tribes there, as I kind of mentioned. Well, the Siksika were usually found along the northern and eastern parts of our land. And the Gaina, they lived in the central part, while the Piikani camped in the mountains on the east slope and along the foothills to the west. Now, as I mentioned, there was a group called Inaksiks, and these people actually lived in the mountains and on the west slope, in an area that people now know today as the Tobacco Plains, Missoula, where the present day city of Missoula is in Montana, Kalispell. In these areas, the Bitterroot Valley in Montana, our Blackfoot people were living in all of these areas. So it wasn't just restricted to the areas I said. We actually were kind of all over. But our homeland is the lands that I mentioned, between the mountains, the Manitoba Escarpment, North Saskatchewan River to the Yellowstone. This is what we considered our homeland. And here on the map, you can kind of see where the tribes, this is probably about 1860, kind of like how the tribes were situated at that time. Now, if we move on to the next image, here we have another map of our lands. And I just kind of want to point out, you can kind of see on this map that there are some sacred sites, and I kind of want to talk a little bit towards that. Now, if we look at the next image, here we have the town of Banff. Now, a lot of people know where Banff is, and it's a resort town. But what a lot of people don't know is that this area here has a holy springs. And to the Blackfoot people, we went to this place because of the springs, the hot springs, the holy springs there. And also, right in the middle, that area known as a tunnel mountain, well, to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, this was the buffalo that's sitting on its belly. And that's what it looks like from a distance. It looks like a buffalo. So this area was actually a sacred site before there was any settlement in this area. And in fact, amongst our ancient stories, one of the stories I was told was that our sacred buffalo stone, Iniskim, actually reached out to our people in this very area. And I've heard a lot of stories towards that effect. But to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, this was Holy Land. This was part of our homeland. And so this area had a lot of significance to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So for those of you who might be watching this program, and if you frequented Banff and you've been up in this area, then understand that the Blackfoot people have called this area home long before any other tribes ever came up into this region. And in fact, the Blackfoot people have been here for thousands of years before any other tribes actually came into this region. So that's in the town of Banff. Now when you go a little bit farther south, you come to this place. Now this is what we in Blackfoot call Ukkatukki. Now over the years, somebody corrupted that word, some settler, and they said, oh, what's this place called? And instead of saying Ukkatukki, he said, oh, I'll call it Okotoks. So to this day, that's what they call the town, Okotoks. But Okotoks is actually a misnomer named after Ukkatukki. And that's what this place is. This is Napi's Rock. Now, according to the Blackfoot legend, this rock chased after our Napi, and Napi gave him a gift. Then he kind of took it back, and then this rock chased after him. And it was only after some bull bats or some animals such they managed to dive bomb it and split it, and then it rested where it's been, and essentially been there since, as far as the Blackfoot know, our entire existence. Napi's Rock. And this is kind of near the little town of Okotoks, if you ever go out that way. But if you ever do go out that way, realize that the Blackfoot-speaking peoples have always used this as a landmark, literally thousands of years before there ever was Calgary or in Okotoks. So let's move on to the next image. Like I said, many of our stories cover our lands, and particularly here in southern Alberta. Now, if you look at this map, you can kind of see this is actually where that rock came from. They'll say when the glaciers were out here that it tore a chunk off of some mountains near Jasper, and then on top of this ice, it came all the way out to Okotoks, sort of thing, and then when it melted, it dropped there. So that's what the scientists say. But of course, the Blackfoot, we know the true story that that rock chased Napi all that distance from those foothills all the way down to where it landed. And so this whole area, as I mentioned, all along the western parts of the land, these contain a lot of the origin stories of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, just like the Napi's Rock. So let's move on to the next image. Now here we have Old Man's Playing Ground. Now this is on the Old Man River. In fact, you know, the name of that river to the Blackfoot was actually the river the old man played on, is how you would translate it to English. But sometime back in the 1870s, when the Mounties bumped into a man named Jerry Potts, who was half Blackfoot and half Scot, well, he could speak Blackfoot fluently like a poet, but his English wasn't that great. So when they wanted to know the name places of a lot of these places, they asked him, "Hey Jerry, what's this river called?" And he would have said, "Oh, that's the Old Man's River." And to this day, this is what they call it. But to the Blackfoot-speaking people, this was the river the old man played on. Now, coming out of the mountains, up near a little town called Maycroft on Highway 22, this is where you can come to this place. Going to the Racing Horse Creek, going up to the north part of the Old Man River. Well, this beautiful area here was actually visited by David Thompson back in the 1790s. And when he came out this way, he saw a courtyard where they used to play this hoop and dart game, and he drew pictures of it, and he talked about his time out there. Well, you know, to this day, proof of the Blackfoot living in this area, the Old Man's Playing Ground, are still there. On the north side of the river, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of teepee rings, all on that north side of the Old Man's Playing Ground. And in fact, this area was known to the Blackfoot people as a place to make peace, a place to make peace. And we made a lot of peace treaties here with a lot of the mountain tribes that would want to come out onto the plains to hunt buffalo or bison. And we'd make an agreement, and usually there was no bloodshed, and they could come and do so long as they were gone by the time we got back. Well, Old Man's Playing Ground, like I mentioned, is up near the town of Maycroft on Highway 22 in an area they call Bob Creek's Wilderness. And this road, there's a back road that'll actually take you out to Coleman near the Crow's Nest Pass. But the Old Man's Playing Ground, this is one of the sacred sites that our Blackfoot people know of. And in fact, in that whole area between the Old Man's Playing Ground, right up to the High River, right up to the Sheep River, all the way up to Banff, all the way up to Nordegg, all of these areas were known by the Blackfoot. And in fact, those tribes that are living in those areas now are all newcomers. They don't even know the lands that well. The Blackfoot have always known our lands very intimately. So let's actually move on to the next image. Now here, just actually east of Old Man's Playing Ground, is you come to the Porcupine Hills. Now this vast Porcupine Hills, this was one of the places our people used to go to collect and forage for all sorts of different things. But also, at the edge of the Porcupine Hills is a place called the Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump. Now, in our language, Head Smashed In is a bisgun. It's just one of literally thousands and thousands of bisgun that are out on the prairies in southern Alberta. But this one's famous because of how it looks. It's literally an embankment, and they drove thousands of animals off the cliffs to their deaths, and they would camp below. And then they would slaughter the animals, they would butcher them, cut them up, and then we would use those meats for the cold winter months to survive. And we would harvest the hides to make our tents and to make our homes and the things that we used from the buffalo. Well, Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump is actually right at the edge of the Porcupine Hills on the east side. And the Porcupine Hills have always been known as a place where our people went to go on vision quests, to hunt the buffalo, to just to gather, just to have a beautiful place where they would venture to. There's water, there's springs all in that area, especially if you're making your way north, like towards the High River area up in that part. So that's kind of like on the northern end of the Porcupine Hills. Well, these areas are all sacred to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Now let's move on to the next image. Let's take a look at a couple more sites. Now here we have, I believe it's Siksikaitsitapi, or the Crow's Nest Mountain. But you know, here, that's another misnomer there. The white people who moved in this area start calling this area the Crow's Nest, or the Crow's Nest Pass, the Crow's Nest Mountain, but they were wrong. Same thing, they were calling it the Crow's Nest, but to the Blackfoot, this isn't the Crow's Nest, this is the Raven's Nest. Now there's a big difference between a crow and a raven. Ravens are a lot bigger, they're huger, and we looked at this bird as sacred. Now the raven is kind of symbolic of the cold maker, the person who brings a cold, Old Man Winter or whatever. But in the Blackfoot stories, that person, the cold maker, this is his lodge, his nitois, or what people call teepee. That's a Sioux word, by the way, and I don't usually use that word because in our language we don't say teepee, we say nitois. So this was the home of the cold maker, the Crow's Nest, and we have a story regarding that, of this great ancient showdown between thunder and between the cold maker. And the reason why here in southern Alberta there's only 2 seasons. There's cold and then there's warm. 6 months of cold, 6 months of warm. And that's all based on this duel, this story that happened. Ancient battle between the cold maker and between thunder. Now, this is where cold maker lives. And this mountain here is Ninastako, or the Chief Mountain. It's kind of right on the border, the 49th parallel between Glacier and Waterton Lakes National Park. But Chief Mountain, now to the Blackfoot legends, our ancient stories, this is the home of Siksikaitsitapi, thunder. And thunder was a fearful creature. And thunder had stolen the wife of a man. And the only way he could get his wife back was to actually go to Coldmaker and get Coldmaker to help him defeat Thunder, to where they came to this agreement. But these stories amongst the Blackfoot literally go back to our beginnings, to our origins as Blackfoot-speaking peoples. And these stories are ancient. At least, in fact, in the Crow's Nest area, they found a dog, bones there at one point, that they knew was a domesticated dog because of the pressure they had on its neck bones, on its shoulder bones. And they realized that the dog that they had found had actually carried a travois. Well, that dog was 6,500 years old. So our people were known as dog people, using the animals the same way. So conceivably, our people have been out here for that long. And that's how old these stories are. But this is another one of our sacred sites within the Blackfoot homeland, is the Chief Mountain. So let's move on to the next image. And here you can kind of see a little bit more of some of the sacred sites we have on the map. We can see that the Chief Mountain and the Crow's Nest is listed there, among other sites. But that's just a kind of a sampling that within the Blackfoot territory, we have stories all over our lands. And it's these stories that we feel give us that connection, that quote-unquote ownership to our land. So let's move on to the next image. Now here we can kind of see a map of North America, and at the top parts there, that's kind of like where the buffalo were, and those tribes that were living in that area. So as the northern plains go, and that's what all of that area on that first map on the left side there, well, that map has all the buffalo hunting tribes that exist in North America. And so you can see the Blackfoot and our allies, the Tsuut'ina, we're kind of right up there in the northern edge. And over time you see the Plains, Cree, and Assiniboine kind of moving into our area because of the trade. But this is where our people were essentially sort of spread out in this buffalo country. Now the northern herds were those herds that were north of the Yellowstone. There were a lot of herds that were south of the Yellowstone, but when it came to trade, most of the traders, the fur traders, they didn't want those hides coming from the southern parts because they were too thin. They wanted the thick hides, and those were the Saskatchewan herds, the buffalo that existed up in the Blackfoot country. These buffalo were thicker, were fatter, and they had thicker hides because of the winter weather. So I just kind of wanted to point out these other neighboring tribes around the Blackfoot, even up into time immemorial. So let's move on to the next image. Actually, let's move on to the next image. Okay, so one of the things like Ponoka, the elk, these animals existed in Blackfoot country, and so these were some of the animals that were part of our diet. Amongst buffalo, we also dined on moose, elk, different types of deer. In fact, let's move on through some of these pictures here. We could find all of these animals within Blackfoot country: the mule deer, the white-tailed deer. We had, let's look at the next image. Antelope, mountain goats. All of these animals existed in Blackfoot lands. We had the moose and bighorn sheep, and all of these were edible. In fact, you know, the Blackfoot people, when it came to our diet, these are the only animals that we actually ate. A lot like the Mosaic Jews in the Bible, the Israelites, we only ate those animals that had 4 legs, that had a split hoof, and that ate grass. We did not eat horses. We did not eat dogs. We did not eat anything with paws and claws, because to the Blackfoot, if it had fingers, that was a sign of intelligence. So we wouldn't eat these animals. In fact, the Blackfoot had a great respect for a lot of the animals, to the point where we didn't even kill them, or we didn't even have words like pets for these beings. In fact, to the Blackfoot people, all of these animals were equals in creation. We were all put here by the Creator. We're all supposed to learn to live and coexist. And that was the Blackfoot attitude in those days. So yes, there was many animals that we did not kill. There's many animals that existed within our homelands, but only certain animals did we use as food. And these animals lived in the mountains, on the plains, and in the foothills. So like I said, the Blackfoot, we were plains, foothills, and mountain people, and we hunted this diversity of animals all over our vast lands. And also when it came to foraging, well, we traveled all over lands just to get some particular goods. In fact, you know, bullberries. These were berries that we used to make the pemmican. Well, actually, pemmican's a Cree word, but for that mixture of berries and for dried meat mixed together in a parfleche bag, well, this is what they call pemmican. Well, you can't make pemmican without berries. And all throughout Blackfoot country, we had all types of berries. We had chokecherries, we had Saskatoons, we had red and yellow bullberries, we had closer to the mountains huckleberries, blueberries. But all of these berries made that pemmican that we relied on to survive over the winter months. Because remember, half the year was nice, the other half was bad weather. And during that bad weather, we had to rely on our stores of food, pemmican, dried meat, to be able to last out those cold months before we could hunt fresh game again. So let's actually look at the next image. Now this is, okay, we're talking about the Blackfoot lands. Now things start to change over time, and one of those things was Rupert's land. Now in 1670, if we can kind of bring up that image a bit, we can see a little bit about how King Charles II of England, he granted a royal charter to create the Hudson's Bay Company under the governorship of the king's cousin, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. So this guy was not even English, he was German. So this Prince Rupert, this became all of his land. So all of this area, all of the waters that drained into the Hudson Bay basically became known as Rupert's land. And so in 1670, the King of England, he figured, okay, well, he's never been on these lands, but they discovered them, so now they can claim them as ownership. And that's what they did in 1670. And hence, that was the reason why the Hudson Bay Company was actually formed, was to explore these lands and to take whatever they could, profits, out of it. So let's actually move into the next image and we can take a look at what Rupert's Land was. So here you can see that picture, everything in purple or pink there. That's Rupert's Land, or what they considered Rupert's Land. So all of those lakes and all of, not lakes so much, but rivers that all drained into the Hudson's Bay, they felt they had rights to. So the English set up in York Factory, the Hudson's Bay Company's first factory there on the Hudson Bay, and it was from that point that they actually started to reach out to the natives and start asking the natives to bring in small fur-bearing mammals for their fur trade, for the fashion trade in Europe. And they asked them to bring them in exchange for a trade good. And so the Hudson Bay and their rivals, the Northwest Company, they managed to convince a lot of tribes east of the Blackfoot to do that, to do something they had never done before, and that's to hunt small fur-bearing mammals as a commodity. That's how they started to see these small animals. And they were intent on bringing all of those furs that existed in that Rupert's Land back to England for the fur trade. So let's look at the next image. Now here, after the purchase of Rupert's Land, or the creation of Rupert's Land, that's when the Hudson Bay Company started to make inroads. They didn't go in very much at first, but then after a period of time, they started to move further and further inland. And eventually they got onto the North Saskatchewan River and made their way into Blackfoot land. Now, before they met the Blackfoot were receiving trade goods from them, but that was through the middlemen in trade, the Cree and the Assiniboine. They would buy goods off of the Hudson Bay Company, and they would bring those goods out to the Blackfoot, charged usually 3 times more than what they're worth, and they would get it, and then they would take those furs all the way back to York Factory, back to the English, and who would in turn take those furs back to Europe. Now this all started after 1670, and this is when the English made their way into Blackfoot country, and we started to deal with the English face to face, and the French. And in fact, the English and the French, or the French first, were the first white people, per se, for the Blackfoot people to meet. And in fact, their blonde hair and their blue eyes and their green eyes all kind of made them look like that deity that the Blackfoot had named Napi. And because of that, we kind of gave them a little bit of a special status at first. But this was the Hudson Bay Company routes when you look at it. And this route here, this was a Northwest Company. So the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company were rivals in the fur trade. And both of them made inroads into North America. And when they did, they bumped into the different tribes. Now, about the same time, the British and the French both came into Blackfoot lands. And the French kind of came through the St. Lawrence Seaway, through the Great Lakes, whereas the English came from York Factory in the Hudson Bay. But both of them arrived in the Canadian West around the same time, and they had a serious rivalry going on. Like, it was none too friendly. In fact, there was a lot of violence. You could almost say there was a lot of conflict between the French and the British when it came to this fur trade. But they made their way in, while they were rivals, into Blackfoot country. And in a way, sometimes the Blackfoot were able to use this to our advantage when we were trading. We'd get better goods for one and play it against the other, the fact that we got something maybe better or more. But this fur trade, this is what introduced the Blackfoot people, or let me put it this way, this is when we first met the white people face to face because of the fur trade. So let's move on to the next image. Now here, this is kind of all the continental divides here in North America. And that Rupert's Land is that blue. You can see that blue area there, divide. Everything south of that blue line would drain into the Hudson Bay. You see the green line there, anything north of that line would drain into the Hudson Bay. And so this is how the king determined what would be considered Rupert's Land. While to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, we knew of these divides, as they call it. And in fact, like I mentioned, we knew of the Great Divide that went all the way the length of this continent. We knew where the rivers all drained into. Those rivers that were from the Belly River area, the North Saskatchewan, we knew that those rivers all drained into the Hudson Bay. But we also knew from the Milk River and all of those rivers south of there, that those rivers all drained into the Gulf of Mexico. So, a lot of people think that the native tribes here on this continent were ignorant of our geography, and that is not true. That is simply not true, and I wish people would stop thinking that way, because the Blackfoot, we knew the whole length of the Rocky Mountains, from the Yukon all the way down to Mexico. And we also knew where the rivers drained to. So we had a vast geographical knowledge of our land. So let's move on to the next image. Okay, so here's the Constitutional Act of 1791, which kind of created what became Canada. So there's Upper Canada and Lower Canada you see there, along with New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. So altogether, these were the first provinces to start to make up what they called Canada. And then Canada, after that time, purchased what they call Rupert's Land off of the Hudson Bay Company. Let's move on to the next image. Now, actually that happened first, is that they bought that. But before this happened, around a little bit after that, there was the Louisiana Purchase. Now, these were lands that were owned by Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France. And around 1803, the American president, Thomas Jefferson, he purchased the Louisiana Territory off of France for about $15 million. Well, of course, all of this was happening across the seas. We never saw any of this. But what's funny is Blackfoot-speaking peoples, Siksikaitsitapi, this sale affected us, affected our lands. And we didn't know that there was people thousands of miles away selling this land. We didn't even know those people existed. Well, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase happened, and a few years later came the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Well, the Lewis and Clark Expedition, those two Blackfoot members died on account of meeting the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and it was because of that up until 1831. So for almost 30 years, the Blackfoot, anybody who came from the United States of America, the southern parts of the continent, into Blackfoot country, never went home, and that was just the truth. Up until 1831, that was the case. And that was all kind of went back to Lewis and Clark and the Louisiana Purchase. Now this affected our people because once the United States of America bought this land, they started sending explorers into Blackfoot country. And like I mentioned, all too often, there was a lot of conflict between the Americans and the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. Now, if we move on to the next image, here we can see the American Fur Company trade route. Now, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up the Mississippi till they got to the Missouri, and then they made their way up the Missouri. And then you can see all those different forts that the American Fur Company set up on their way into Blackfoot country. Now, if you look up there, Fort McKenzie and Fort Benton, Fort Union, these were the first three. The other forts, we never went there. We never dealt with those people because that's not in Blackfoot country. That's more in other tribes' lands. But when you got up the upper Missouri, then you came into Blackfoot lands and the Blackfoot country, as you put it. And so the first American fort to start trading with the Blackfoot on a regular basis, because it was right at the edge of the Blackfoot territory, was Fort Union, and that was in 1831. And then after 1831, Fort Union was established as the fort that the Blackfoot traded at. They actually moved in farther till they came to Fort McKenzie. And then the Blackfoot would trade with the American Fur Company at Fort McKenzie up until about 1840, late 1840s. And then finally in 1850, they set up Fort Benton, and that was the farthest post inland that a steamboat could go from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Mississippi, all the way up to Missouri, all the way to Fort Benton. And then Fort Benton became like a warehouse capital. This is where all the warehouse came for the goods coming upstream, and then for all the goods going downstream, Fort Benton was the place. And funny enough, Fort Benton was actually on Blackfoot land. According to the Lame Bull Treaty, they shouldn't have been there, but they were there and they carried out their business. And more often than not, they were the capital of the whiskey trade that began in the United States of America from 1865 right up until 1870 and continued on in the Whoop-Up Trail, southern Alberta, from 1870 up until the Mounties' arrival in 1873. Well, before all of that, this was the route the American Fur Company took up into Blackfoot country. So even though we were already trading with the British and the French, when the Americans came into it, into that trade, then the Blackfoot people started to lose land. And in fact, it was in the United States of America that the Blackfoot first experienced major land loss. Now, if we move on to the next image, well, what was the result of all of this? Well, here we have a picture of the treaty. Now, all that land that I showed you, that vast land that the Blackfoot controlled from the mountains, all the way to the Qu'Appelle Valley, Touchwood Hills, from the North Saskatchewan River all the way down to the Yellowstone. Well, this is what the Blackfoot people considered our homeland, always. But then this event took place. Now, this was the signing of Treaty Number 7. Now, after the signing of Treaty Number 7, then our land base was defined as what you see on the map. The Government of Canada, along with the other tribes, didn't take into consideration our lands, because before the government actually came to the Blackfoot people, they had made 6 separate agreements with, at that time, were our enemies. And those people were the Cree, the Assiniboine, the Stoney, or with the Assiniboine, the Métis. All of these tribes were what they called the Iron Confederacy. So the Blackfoot Confederacy tribes and the Iron Confederacy were actually enemies for about 100 years, up until the signing of the Treaty Number 7. Now, for that whole time that we were fighting, when Treaties 1, Treaties 4, and Treaty 6 were signed, all these treaties actually took huge amounts of Blackfoot land. And these are agreements between the Queen's representatives and our enemies before they ever came to the Blackfoot people. So if you wondered whatever happened to all of that Blackfoot territory that we considered our homeland, well, now we can tell you is we were ripped off. Treaty 4 took a huge amount of the Blackfoot land without any Blackfoot participation in that negotiation. Treaty Number 6 did the same thing. They took a huge amount of the Blackfoot land, and these are agreements done between the Government of Canada and our enemies at the time, long before they ever came to the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So after 1877 and the signing of Treaty Number 7, that yellow part is what they considered Treaty Number 7 lands, and that this is the land that the Blackfoot surrendered. Of course, that's not true. To the Blackfoot people, we've never ever looked at that agreement as a land surrender. Those are words that white people brought in years later. To the Blackfoot people, the Treaty Number 7 has always been a land share. This is our land, and we chose to share the land with the newcomers, being all those people that are now make up Canada. So this is what Treaty 7 did. It got rid of that true picture of what the Blackfoot lands entailed, and then after those agreements only gave us this little piece they called Treaty 7, because they already made agreements and with regarding our land with enemy tribes, with other tribes that didn't have rights to those lands. So if we move on to the next image, we kind of see here of all that which we considered our territory, our homeland, now is reduced to just these little reserves that you see here within this dark green. You see this orange. Well, up top there you can see the Siksikaitsitapi Nation. That's where we are situated right now, the Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park. And that is what's left, what was given to us by treaty, compared to what used to be our homeland. And then you can see the other tribes that were part of that treaty. Off to the west of us, you have the Stoney Nakoda tribes, who now are a part of this land, who never were a part of the land, but now are part of it because of the treaty. Now when you look south of us, you see the other Blackfoot tribes. You see the Blood tribe, or the Gaina. Now the Gaina are the biggest tribe in Canada, and they were just given that little area of land as well. And then you look to the east of them, you see the little reservation of the North Piikani, Brockett. Well, this is what's left of what once was our huge, huge territory. Now if you look on the other side of the border, then you see the Blackfeet, the Blackfeet Reservation. Of course, they're not Blackfeet, they're Piikani, or those are the Southern Piikani, part of our tribe. And these people have the biggest reserve. of all the Blackfoot tribes. They're in the United States of America. But that reserve actually is like a checkerboard. Half of it's owned by Blackfoot-speaking peoples, and the other half is owned by white people, people who aren't even Blackfoot, but they own part of that reserve. So this is kind of what happened to our people after signing of treaty, after the Louisiana Purchase, after Rupert's Land. Because up until those times, the Blackfoot people knew very well what we considered our homeland. And the honest truth is, if should these United States of America, Canada, Mexico ever cease to exist, the Blackfoot-speaking peoples will still remember what we considered our homeland. So let's move on to the next image. Now here, after the signing of the treaty, is kind of what was given to the Blackfoot, particularly my tribe, the Siksikaitsitapi. Now this is a picture of our reserve. After the signing of the treaty, this was all the land that was given to us. Now, the funny thing is, if we look at the next image, you can see all those same lands, but all of those darker brown areas that you see, these lands were sold to us illegally. It was the Indian agent Gooderham and Markle and them who sold that land, and they managed to get some puppet people, leaders amongst the Blackfoot, people who agreed with them and who would sign, and they used them as chiefs, and they managed to get all of that land that you see in the kind of the brown. All of that land was sold, and that's what we call the 1910 land surrender. Now this was something that the Blackfoot people never wanted, but even up until after the signing of the treaty, about even 40 years later, these people were still trying to rip us off of our land, and they in fact were successful, because even to this day, we just recently had a global settlement where we got some monies from this land sale. In my opinion, nowhere near enough as to what it was actually worth. We were ripped off again. But this land, it was sold by the Indian agents in the 20th century. So the Blackfoot-speaking peoples lost a lot of our land. And in fact, other tribes, the Kainai and the Piikani here in Canada, were also affected by these same Indian agents who sold off large portions of their land as well. And these are things that happened to our people after the signing of the treaty. Now let's move on to the next image. Now these 4 flags, once again, these flags make up the present day Blackfoot-speaking peoples, the Siksikaitsitapi. And those tribes are the Blood tribe, are the Kainai, the Siksikaitsitapi, the Piikani, and in the United States of America, the Piikani. But altogether, these 4 nations make up the Blackfoot-speaking peoples, the Siksikaitsitapi. And I think with the next image, that's the end of our program for today. I want to invite you next week to sit in on the next webinar we have, and we're going to talk to you at that time about the Dog Days. And we'll talk a little bit about the archaeological record, and we'll also talk to origin stories and those stories that make us as Siksikaitsitapi believe and feel that we've always been from this particular area. So join me next week, and we'll talk more about the Blackfoot-speaking peoples and our land. And in the meantime, take care of one another. Remember, there's still some diseases, pestilence, COVID out there, a lot more flu. So take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and in the meantime, Kitawahsinoon, till I see you again.
Hey,